Hello, everyone. I'm Ted Everingham. I'm in the historic Alger House at the War Memorial on the shores of Lake St. Clair and Grosse Pointe Farms, Michigan, inviting you to another of our live streaming American Democracy series conversations. Call them conversations because that's what they are, as you'll see when we proceed. This program is being recorded, and the link will be available on the website for the War Memorial beginning probably Thursday, maybe Friday, and the program will be up for a while. It's just a real pleasure to invite Nathan Bomey back with us. He was with us in November. Some of you may remember he was with us to talk about his book on the Detroit bankruptcy. More about that in a moment, but he's back now. Journalist, been a journalist since high school back here in Michigan. He started working for his weekly newspaper in his hometown of Saline, Michigan, at the ripe old age of 16. Went off to Eastern Michigan University. After graduating in 2006, he became a business reporter for several publications in Southeast Michigan, including the Detroit Free Press, where he covered General Motors, and of course the Detroit bankruptcy. In 2015, we lost him. He moved to Washington, D.C. area as a business reporter for USA Today. In December of 2021, he joins Axios to serve as a reporter and co-author for the daily Axios Closer newsletter, which features the biggest business news of the day. Congratulations on that, Nathan. That's since you were with us.
Thank you. Yeah.
Nathan's also an author of three, I should say, nationally publicized nonfiction books. The one we'll talk about tonight is called Bridge Builders, Bringing People Together in a Polarized Age. That's a 2021 book. The profiles of Americans who are working hard to combat that polarization. Another book, After the Fact, The Erosion of Truth and the Inevitable Rise of Donald Trump, written in 2018 on the age of misinformation. And of course, Detroit Resurrected to the Bankruptcy and Back, the 2016 book that we talked about in November about the Detroit bankruptcy. If you're not muted, please mute yourself. Thank you.
Speaker, and he's talking about.
Can you please mute yourselves? Thank you. The book on the bankruptcy has been hailed by the New York Times Book Review as, quote, a valuable work of urban policy. And while we talked about it in November, if you haven't read it, I certainly recommend it. More recently, and this is exciting, Nathan served as the principal screenwriter and producer of a full-length documentary film entitled Gradually, Then Suddenly, The Bankruptcy of Detroit, which is expected to be released this year, 2022. Back in October, the film won the Library of Congress Levine Ken Burns Prize for Film. It's a $200,000 honor given to nearly finished documentaries on American history subjects. I can't wait to see that. Let me also introduce Ernie Miller. Wave your hand, please. Freshman at Albion College from Kalamazoo, Michigan, where she is now because they're still in their holiday break. Interested in political science and international studies and hopes to go to law school. And she says, or, that's ambition, or get a master's degree in public policy. And Sam Howard. Sam's from Lapeer, Michigan. I assume you're in Lapeer tonight, Sam. Interested in political science and public administration, perfect for tonight. Wants to go to graduate school or law school after Albion, and I suspect he will and will do very well. He's with he's studying at the Gerald Ford Institute for Leadership in Public Policy and Service at Albion College. The associate director of that institute, Eddie Visco. Eddie, wave your hand. Eddie's with us tonight, and glad to have you, and arranged for the two students to be with us. So as we go, if you have questions for Nathan, please use the chat function on Zoom, and we'll be curating those questions and passing them on. Sometime Ms. Miller and Mr. Howard from Albion College will be free to ask questions live. So Nathan, let me kick this off, and thank you so much for being with us again.
Yeah, this is fun. I'm glad to be here.
Well, it's fun for me, fun for us, and informative too. You're home in the Washington area?
Yeah, I am.
Okay. Let me start this by just asking what may be the obvious question. What in the world, let me back up. I, like most of us, am very concerned about the polarization in our society.
Yeah.
Not just in politics, but just, over the coffee at the coffee shop. People seem to be way out here and way out there, and they don't talk in the middle anymore. I'm worried about that. And that's what your book is about. How did you come to write the book, and how did you find the people that you talked to, whose stories you told in the book?
Yeah. Well, it's a tale of multiple stories of what led me to write this book, but two things. It, in some ways, is a sequel to my second book, called After the Fact, which is about the age of misinformation and why it infects our society. This published in 2018. And I walked away from that project really thoroughly convinced that we are doomed, that there's no way we're ever going to get on the same page. We're just going to continue to spiral downward. And I said, I've got to go out and meet people who aren't accepting the status quo, and then so that thought process was going on in my mind. And then in late 2018, my wife and I took a metro ride from my apartment in Arlington to downtown DC. We were going to go see the National Christmas Tree, which is right there just south of the White House lawn. If you ever get an opportunity to come to DC during the holidays, it's really fun to go see that. And nice little train sets going around the tree, and it's just a really beautiful sight. So we're walking down to the tree, and we get down and we see some commotion, and it seems really dark, and we're like, what's going on? Why is this? We walk up. It turns out the tree is out, the lights are out, because we were in the midst of, you may remember, the longest government shutdown in US history, which kind of seems like ancient history now, because it sort of is, with everything that's happened since then. But if you recall, the Republicans and Democrats were arguing over President Trump's proposal to build a wall along the border of Mexico and the US, which of course is the opposite of a bridge. This we couldn't, basically our polarization had reached a point where the two sides couldn't talk to each other and about this extremely contentious issue, such to a point that the entire government shut down, and we can't even keep the Christmas tree lights on because the electricity bill wasn't being paid. So basically Christmas was canceled in 2018 in DC because of our polarization. And so it's cute. It's like, a little Rudolph reference maybe, but the truth is, of course, that event was followed by even more polarizing events, first impeachment of Trump, a contentious election, President Trump's false accusations of election fraud, second insurrection, second impeachment, and then a pandemic. Which I had started, of course, before the election. It's so many, and then now debates over vaccines and debates over, shutdowns and masks and all of these things. And the point I make in the book is that one of the points I make in the book is that these one-off events will continue occurring. We'll have more polarizing events, and there may be a hope at some point that one of them will be the one that finally makes us wake up to this issue of the fact that we have to do something about why are we so divided. But I came to the conclusion that that singular events are not enough to do that. They're not enough to change a culture. This is a much more difficult solution, a difficult issue than that. That's why, after 9/11, eventually people kind of, felt divided again. Maybe in the early weeks of the pandemic, it felt like, okay, we're all sort of going to get through this together. And then that feeling kind of evaporated pretty quickly too. And so I said, but long before the pandemic, of course, I said, I wanted to go out and meet people who were just not accepting that status quo. People who were trying to bridge differences, whether it was politics, race, religion, class, or culture. And so starting right after that government shutdown, late 2018, for the next year and a half, like right up till the pandemic, basically, I started going out and talking to people. Went to Charlottesville, to talk to groups that were dealing with the aftermath of what happened there in 2017. Went to Minneapolis, actually, before George Floyd. Went in Detroit. I go to Michigan all the time, still have family there. in DC, went to throughout the country and then did all kinds of phone interviews to try to put together a patchwork of stories that would paint this forensic portrait of what can we do, and what can we as individuals do, what can we as a society do to try to begin to combat this crisis of what political scientists call affective polarization, which is where, the students on the call maybe have learned about this. It's where polarization gets so bad that you don't just disagree with somebody because of the issue, you disagree with who they are. You have a hatred in some cases for them as a person. You have true distaste for their humanity. And that's the point where we've reached, where people have gone far beyond disagreeing about the issues, which is really strange, because one of the points of hope that I can provide is that on the issues, we're not as far apart as you might think. When you look at the data on issues like immigration, for example, Americans tend to often agree on a lot of the major issues, and yet we feel more polarized than ever. And I think perception is reality. If we feel that way, then we are that way, at least because in politics, that feeling drives rhetoric and that drives policy. And so I wanted to go out and meet those people and tell their stories. And so that's what I did.
So how did you find them? You don't look on the yellow pages for
Right.
bridge builders.
Right, exactly. I know. Well, as a millennial, I felt like maybe I should start with Googling them, but that wasn't really a good idea because there's not really many ways to find them like that. No. So a couple different ways. I had 2 or 3 examples of people I was aware of, or groups I was already aware of, that I thought might be good anchors for different chapters. And then beyond that, I had issues that I knew I wanted to cover. So for example, I mentioned Charlottesville. When I started the book, the white supremacy incident that happened there in 2017, August 2017, was only a year and a couple months old. And I said, there's got to be groups down there or people who are trying to figure out how to reckon with what's happened and how to begin to try to heal this community and deal with this like profound legacy of racism and and political and political issues. And so I started networking with some groups down there, and one thing led to another, and someone said, well, who you need to talk to is this group called the Charlottesville Clergy Collective, which is this interfaith organization of leaders in Charlottesville, who actually was formed in the wake of the Charleston, South Carolina church shooting from 2015, but didn't really become that active until the 2017 episode in Charlottesville. And they have been grappling with what happened and trying to basically address the deep-rooted issues that Charlottesville and Virginia have been dealing with since well before the Civil War, of racism and slavery and all of these things that continue to cast a shadow over Charlottesville today. And so that's kind of how I got that example, and then just grew from there. Reporters, one thing we're supposed to be good at least, is finding sources. And so you network and you just kind of gradually talk to people and figure out things organically. I'll conclude this comment with this. The most difficult one to find was, I knew I wanted to do a chapter on social media in some capacity. I wanted to find someone or some group that was using social media in a productive capacity to try to bring people together instead of tearing them apart. And probably, as I suspected would be the case, that was extremely difficult, because there's just not many examples of people who are actively trying to use social media to do that, because there's so many examples of the opposite. And so I was able to find a group, we can talk about if you'd like, but a group that is using social media, in particular Instagram and authentic photography, to help bridge divides between international cultures and create authentic portraits of what life is like in Africa, for example, for people in, say, Uganda or Namibia, and try to basically have this international connection where you in America or some other country can see that, listen, there are people there that get coffee every day. They work on their cars. They go up elevators, like these very mundane things in life that make you realize they're human too. And so that was a cool chapter, because it gave me an opportunity to say, listen, there are ways that we can use even these tools that seem to be used only for the bad, we can actually use them in ways to, stitch together these bonds that are broken.
I found that chapter, the organization that started was Everyday Africa,
Yes.
where reporters are sent to Africa and they have these preconceived notions about everybody, poverty is rampant.
Right.
Nobody has a roof over their head. Nobody has enough to eat.
Right.
And they began to see very, as you say, very mundane things. Normal people.
Yeah.
They were staying at a decent hotel. They
Yeah.
were having decent meals, and then they go out and take pictures of people starving to death, and come
Yeah.
back and realize that we had a inaccurate picture. All,
Yes.
all that they were taking pictures of were there. They were true,
Right.
but the picture was incomplete.
Yeah. And I think that story that got me thinking about an element of this book, which I tried not to neglect, which is, what do we as journalists or as people, members of the news media like myself, what's our responsibility in this conversation? Because we can't be exempt from the conversation about how to begin building bridges. And so we can talk about that too, if you want, because I think it's critical.
It is critical, and we will talk about that because I think you bear a huge responsibility, those of you who are journalists.
Yeah.
Let me see if Kearney or Sam have questions before we go further. Either of you.
I was going to ask about the role of the media, but you already covered that really well. So
No, we should talk more about it. And go ahead.
I mean, so you mentioned it's like your responsibility, but how difficult can that be, like, as you're just like one individual and part of a much larger social media scale where everyone's worried about clicks and likes and shares and everything, and how Facebook like plays into that with all the hyperpolarization for their own gain and profit?
Yeah, I think it's a really difficult question, a really difficult issue, and a really important question. And I think the first thing to say is I'm not sure there are there are no easy answers. There's no question about it. But the way I address it in the book is, first we have to at least start by acknowledging that we as the media have played a role in dividing people, and I think that's really difficult for us as journalists to talk about sometimes, because we often like to view ourselves as sort of nonpartisan, emotionally removed observers or reporters of what's happening. And that is the goal, and often should be the case, where we should try to accomplish that. But I think that what we have to acknowledge is that in some cases, with the way we frame our stories, with the decisions we make on the stories that we assign and we write, and the way we write them and the way we portray them in terms of photos and video, that those things can exacerbate divides. And so, I think what he was just discussing, like how we are portraying international cultures can, I think people in the Middle East have a lot to say about how they were portrayed in the aftermath of 9/11, for example, and that still resonates today for Americans who have perceptions of what people of Arabic descent are like. But I think more immediately in a chapter, I did a chapter with a group in Appalachia that is reporting about the people of Appalachia and what the challenges that they face, but also the opportunities and the good things that are happening there, and to paint a fuller picture of what's happening there and the issues there. And because after the 2016 election, I'm afraid to say that those of us in the media did a profound disservice to the people of Appalachia by swooping in, national media and just kind of telling these very caricatured portrait stories of the people there, like the coal miner, toothless coal miner, sort of that kind of thing, and with the Confederate flag on their truck, and some of which of course is true, and sometimes those stories are correct, but a lot of times there are LGBTQ people living in West Virginia, there are Muslim people living in Appalachian areas of Pennsylvania. I mean, there are there's diversity, there are fascinating stories, and people who can't be put into a box. Why did West Virginia have one of the biggest teacher strikes of the last 2 decades in America a couple of years ago? It was because there is a spirit of unionization and such there that you might not associate with a state that is so closely associated with Republican politics. So it's like we in the national media, I think, have a responsibility, this is to answer your question, to look a little bit more toward the local media, like this group I wrote about called 100 Days in Appalachia. They're just local journalists telling local stories authentically, and we need to partner with them instead of like sending our own journalists in for like 3 days to tell us some story that's almost inevitably not going to really tell a true story of what's happening there. And I think the good news is you're seeing national media being more and more willing to collaborate now with those local groups and tell those stories authentically, because I think it's critical to building bridges. Like if I write a story that's not reflective of people, whether they're in Appalachia or whether they're in the Bronx or whether they're in Miami, that's not authentic to who they are, then I have a powerful platform, and I've created this image for other people that may be rooted in stereotypes and maybe actually, exacerbating the divides. And so I think storytelling is a way we can begin to heal some of those divides, but only if we think very sophisticatedly about how we might accidentally sometimes perpetuate stereotypes.
Your chapter you just referred to, I think it was called From Caricature to Nuance.
Yeah.
I found it particularly fascinating about the 100 Days in Appalachia, where national journalists were telling a more accurate story of the people in the area by asking local journalists to collaborate with them and tell that story. It's a powerful thing.
Right. And we need to respect those local journalists, understand that they can tell those stories. They're not biased. They can tell them. They're going to also illuminate the challenges and the problems. They're not going to paper over that. They have more of an interest in dealing with those issues than any of us do. So I think we can trust them, and maybe I'm biased because I started as a local journalist and spent years in Saline and then Ann Arbor, writing local, news stories. My career started there in the Saline Reporter, where I'm 17 years old, editor sending me to, Lodi Township Board of Trustees meetings, where I'm like responsible for figuring out what is going on with the septic system zoning debate and why are they arguing about like public safety funding and all of this stuff. And I have no idea why my editor trusted me to tell those stories, but for some reason he did. And I figured it out. But I ended up developing a trusted relationship with the readers because they knew me. It was a small town. And I believe that we can't really expect Americans to begin to trust the media again if they don't know a journalist. How can you expect someone to trust a journalist if they don't know one? And so I think we need to be investing also in local journalism. And I think a lot of times it needs to be probably in a nonprofit capacity, because for-profit journalism models are so broken that we, in many cases, that we need to rely on probably some nonprofit funding to begin to rebuild local journalism.
You're interested, and I read the chapter about local journalism and knowing your background, starting as a teenager in Saline and working your way up. And I was reminded of a young kid from Jackson, Michigan, who worked at the local radio station in Albion when he was in college, and being sent off to city council meetings and township board meetings and that sort of thing. And the skinny kid with the deep voice. And yet, when I went to get a character and fitness reference from the police department in Albion, Michigan, when I applied for the state bar, just pick it up. It's here. They knew me. They trusted me. So
right. Well, and I'll say this, that real quick, when I went for this book, I actually called the Lodi Township supervisor for the first time in 15 years and asked her, I was just curious. I said, do you get any news coverage anymore? Is anyone coming to your meetings? And she said, haven't had people come to our meetings in years. And so the point is, there's no reporter there. Now that's bad for civics, it's bad for democracy, because reporters can serve as watchdogs. They can keep an eye on what's happening there. But it's also bad for just general trust in the media, because when there's a vacuum of news coverage, I think that's going to lead to more and more distrust. And the studies show Americans are more likely to trust local journalists than national journalists. So we need more local journalists if we want to restore some respect and trust in the media.
On the other hand, if some scandalous event were to occur in Lodi Township, someone would be there.
Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah.
If it bleeds, it leads.
Right, exactly. They'd find it, and then and that's, it's important to cover those stories, but sometimes it's the basics, the blocking and tackling of journalism, that it's not sexy, but that's the stuff that people really need.
Yeah. Sam, do you have a question?
So you were talking about, Nathan, how we need to trust like local journalists and we need to be able to have a relationship with them. But I guess one of the things that I was really thinking about when thinking about some questions was how can we approach and kind of foster these conversations with people who don't really want to bridge the gap?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a really important question, and one that I tried to grapple with in the book. And I think, this is the way I put it. So there are, you can't build, first off, you have to start by understanding, can't build a bridge across an ocean, like it's just not possible. But I concluded after researching this book that oftentimes the divides that we think are oceans are actually more like rivers. They look wider than us. They look like you can never possibly build a bridge across that. But a lot of times when you get to know somebody, or you can form a relationship, even on a very ephemeral level sometimes, then you can start to gradually understand the other person's humanity. And I think it starts with that. And it also starts with realizing, and I think it's okay to say this, that bridge building can actually be a very selfish endeavor, in the sense that, like, to answer your question, the other person may have no interest in forming that divide, but I can assure you that it is in your interest to try to bridge that divide, because Martin Luther King Jr., Dr. King said, we're caught together in an inescapable web of mutuality, and which basically, in other words, I can't get ahead unless you get ahead, and if you're not, then I'm not. But another person who you probably wouldn't know, Valerie Kaur, who wrote this amazing book a couple years ago called "See No Stranger," she the way she puts it is, you are a part of me I do not yet know, is essentially that. She keeps repeating that phrase in her book. You are a part of me I do not yet know, meaning I may not understand why I need you. I need to form a connection with you, but I know that I need to, because we are somehow caught together in that inescapable web of mutuality. And so I think it starts with understanding that maybe I need to be the one to step out and start building that bridge, even if I shouldn't have to. And I think that's the thing to keep in mind. It's like, they may be 100% wrong. You could be 100% right. Like, for example, if I have an argument with my wife, I'm 100% right. Like it's pretty obvious. Like it's, I'm never wrong. So, but no, I mean, but the reality is usually you're at least like maybe 1% wrong, and on every issue. I mean, there's like there are some issues, of course, like just, like racism and just things that are just obvious, like slavery or something, like obvious issues where there's no room for any middle ground. And that's okay. And that's the way it should be. But here's the thing about building bridges. You don't always meet in the middle, which I find to be such an interesting thing. So for this book, I actually went and talked to real life bridge builders, people like engineers, contractors, people who design bridges. And I said, tell me what I need to know about the real process. And they said, you know what? Sometimes you actually build the bridge from one side of the ravine to the other side. I found that to be so interesting. So sometimes the bridge doesn't get built like this, it gets built like this. And, so it's like, and sometimes it gets built in stages and sections, it's just such an interesting analogy, because in real life, sometimes the other person might not be willing to step out onto that ledge. But the thing is, no one changes the world from an island. Like, you've got to have a bridge if you want to change it. And so, that's my feeling now in terms of how do you do that? How do you begin to actually reach someone who has no interest? Well, I think, and this is going to sound counterintuitive and countercultural, because it starts with listening. Like, I mean, I honestly wrote like 70,000 word book to write, basically like, you have to start listening. And again, even if what they're saying is oftentimes way off base, I'm not talking about listening to hate or that sort of thing. I'm talking about listening to perspectives, because there oftentimes are perspectives that are reasonable on an issue, whether, and even if they could be reasonable, at least from that person's vantage point. And I'll give you this analogy, and then we'll go on to the next question. But the metaphor here is I'll use this, the metaphor you guys will know. just down the road from you, at least not down the road, but not that far away, the big house, Michigan Stadium. If you're sitting in Michigan Stadium, 110,000 people, and I've been there many times back when I lived in Saline. And you're on one side of the field and you see the play unfold on the field in some capacity, and you're convinced what you saw, and there's no way that it could the play unfolded in any other way. Person stepped out of bounds or didn't step out of bounds, or got a touchdown or didn't get a touchdown, whatever. But if you go around to the other side of the stadium and you look at things from the point of view of someone who was sitting way over there, they'll show you, oh, I saw it like this, and like you didn't see what I saw because you weren't sitting in my vantage point. And you'll go around and you might say, no, listen, they're still wrong. Like they still didn't see what they thought they saw, but at least I have a better understanding of why they think they saw the way they saw them. And guess what? It's like we've all watched a game on TV where you see the play and you're like, I know for sure what I saw, and then you saw the replay and you're like, I did not see that. So we've all had that experience, and I think that's the way it is in real life. A lot of times, the point is, you can't gain an understanding or respect for someone else's perspective unless you're sitting shoulder to shoulder. I think you have to be, and that means forming a relationship, getting to know the person, listening to them, even if you still disagree.
We're having a conversation with Nathan Bomey, whose book, written last year, is the subject of tonight's conversation. The book is called Bridge Builders, Bringing People Together in a Polarized Age. If ever there was a timely subject, that's it, and a huge subject. If you're watching at home or in your office or wherever you are, you're welcome to raise questions for Nathan through the chat function, and we're monitoring those. We'll pass those along to Nathan as we go. Let's go back to Kearney in Kalamazoo, my Albion College colleague. You have another question?
So how can these conversations that start at an individual level, how can we build those to be nationwide conversations?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And it's really important because, the focus of this book was primarily on like organic individual conversations, and individual relationships, and how we can kind of start on a grassroots level. Because I do tend to believe that it has to start on a grassroots level, if only because, at least in our political world, the political atmosphere is such now that we don't really live in a top-down atmosphere where the politicians kind of like tell people the way it is and then they follow suit. It tends to be the way around. They tend to react to people saying what they say and feeling the way they feel, and then they basically put their finger in the wind, and that's how they act. So I tend to think that if the people change, the politicians will change. But I do think that there are some things we can do on a broader scale, on a more institutional level, to use the same principle of like building relationships between people who aren't like each other, and do that on a big scale. Like I think, and that's the fundamental thread of this book, is that if you really want to bridge divides, you have to get to know somebody who looks differently, thinks differently, prays differently, someone who votes differently. It's like, you're not going to cause any change by simply talking and knowing people who look like you, think like you, pray like you. It's like you're simply not going to be able to understand, let alone reach other people, if you don't get out there. So how can we extend that principle on a more institutional and broader scale, national scale? I think there are a few things we can do. One of the things that I was particularly compelled by when I researched for this book is the idea of expanding our the national public service model extensively. Like we have groups like AmeriCorps, for example, that are doing tremendous public service work, but they're still doing it on a pretty small scale. But what we've seen is that those public service opportunities often serve as relationship building opportunities as well, in a twofold capacity. One, you develop a relationship with the people you're serving alongside of. Again, that shoulder to shoulder relationship where you get to know them and you actually maybe gain some perspective for them, even if they're a lot different than you. And then you also often gain a perspective, an understanding for the people you're serving. Because whether it's someone who's living in poverty or someone who, is down on their luck for some reason, you may get to know them, whether their skin color is different, whether they, worship at a different place, whatever, or they live somewhere else, because America is increasingly polarized by the places we live. And so, I think that, this is what's interesting as well. There's bipartisan support in Washington, a phrase we don't use very often, for an expansion of a national public service campaign. In fact, Barack Obama signed into law a tripling of the number of public service positions to like 1 million or something like that. But it hasn't been funded yet. You guys in public policy know all about how that works, where the authorization is there, but the funding's not there yet. So got to get it funded. But the point is that, John F. Kennedy understood the power of public service, and Republicans often like it because they see it as almost, there's a sort of a pseudo-religious element of it, in the sense that you're serving your neighbor. And then Democrats tend to see it from a little bit more of a progressive perspective, in terms of like, just civic services and, the rights of human rights and that sort of thing. Either way, we actually have some common ground there. So I think that that's one thing. And then another thing is, I think actually in education, I think we can do a lot, especially in schools, where I think schools can start to structure their lessons and structure coursework to encourage, first off, discussions and interaction with information that maybe contradicts what you think about the world, because that's critical as well to starting to open your mind and gain perspective. But also things like, we live in this Zoom oriented world now, where students could do class projects with kids in another district. Like, why are we, limiting ourselves now to the people who live in your area? Why don't kids in Detroit work with kids in Livonia, or kids from Grand Rapids work with kids from Ann Arbor? I mean, we could do that now, and something that was impossible before. So I think we need to say there are ways we can kind of almost force some of those relationships to be built, especially because I believe kids are still, we still have a chance to reach kids. Like, if we could agree that, and hopefully we disagree, but if we agree that adults are unreachable, we're not reachable. No one can change our mind. No one can change us. Hopefully we can agree that the young people are still forming their worldviews in a lot of ways. And that maybe, like, if you're in middle school or even younger, you may still be, we can still influence the way that you are going to consider the world around you and form relationships with other people.
One of your chapters dealt with the very thing about service and working side by side, and sort of the foxhole thing. We're in this together, and we learn about that. I see a couple names on my screen that remind me of my membership in Rotary, where we do service projects. And the thing that I found most useful about all that were the projects where we're meeting with and working with people who don't look like us, who are not our neighbors, but yes, are our neighbors. And that's sort of the grassroots part of all this. But I'm back to Kearney's question, is how do you drive that? How do you get 100 people in the United States Senate start talking to each other? And maybe it's just because the American public starts at the grassroots level and insists that people begin to talk to each other.
Yeah, and I think, you have to, I think one way you can do it is by, you start to find people who are kind of on the fringe of their group. We live in this hyper tribalized society where everyone sticks to the people in their group and they never, go beyond that. But there's always some people who are right there on the fringes, or kind of like they go back and forth between groups, and they have some respect with both groups. For a person I would give it as an example, who I profiled in one of the chapters of this book, his name is Bob Inglis. He's a former Republican congressman from South Carolina, views himself as pretty, strong conservative, pro gun rights, anti-abortion, all these things, but has become a very vocal advocate for the need to take action on climate change. And, since leaving Congress, he has formed a group where he is trying to it's exclusive to Republicans, which sounds antithetical to what we're talking about tonight, but he says it needs to be only Republicans because we need to show that there are Republicans who want to take action on climate change. So he has people sign. He's got tens of thousands of members now. People is showing he wants to basically prove to Congress that if you try, the Republicans in Congress, that if you take action, you're not going to get, uprooted from office. And so he's someone who has the ear of some of the conservatives on Capitol Hill. And I think people like that, yes, and you're probably not going to make much progress by reaching someone who watches Newsmax all day, but you might reach someone who is not immersed in that sort of thing, but has relationships with the people who watch Newsmax all day, because those are the relationships that will change minds. One of the things I want to leave you with, and I know we're not done, but if you don't forget, one thing from this conversation, I think it's important to walk away with this belief that people can change, and they do. Americans change; they change all the time. You just have to look back through the course of history to see how much Americans have changed on the collective societal level, but also an individual level. And I'll give you a concrete example that you're probably not thinking about because it seems like it happened overnight to you, perhaps, but it took some time. Gay marriage, support for gay marriage in this country. In 2004, 2005, don't hold me to the exact number, it was 67% of Americans opposed. No, it was 61. I think it was 61% of Americans opposed, according to Gallup, 31% supported. By 16 years later, it flipped. It was like 67% or something like that support, and only like 30% or so against. Now, if you travel back in a time machine to the year 2005 and talk to somebody about that issue, and you tell them in 15 years, America's going to completely change its mind on this issue, they think you're crazy, but people actually did. And of course, we know now it's legal. And I talked to a few experts about it who I wanted to get like these really scholarly explanations for how people change their minds. And I think there's whole books that could be written about this, but for a couple, they felt it came down to people realized they had relationships and people in their own lives with members of the LGBTQ community, and they wanted those people to have rights. And it came down to the simple fact is they knew somebody, who was a member of that community, and they didn't want that person to live in a world without marriage equality. And so those relationships were critical, at the very least, to changing people's perspectives on that issue. So who's to say that some of the other issues that divide us today won't change over time as well?
I have a question from one of the people watching tonight. Actually, it's a couple questions. Let me work their way through them. The most important one to me, the one I'm most interested in, is the last one. Are there ways in which journalists are being held accountable to provide the truth? Also, do you think issues with polarization are rising due to the growing access for anyone to post almost anything, such as highly biased opinions on the internet, and sometimes do so in a way that make their opinion appear to be a factual source? How do we combat those issues that can be contributing to increased polarization while still protecting free speech? You only have 3 hours to answer.
Well, okay. Firstly, on whether journalists are being held accountable or not, I think it's a very difficult question. I think some are, some aren't, and I certainly think social media has in some ways become its own source of accountability, in some ways good, in some ways bad. But I would say, this is what I would say is that I think the mainstream media, those of us who really are trying to where the facts and the truth are centered to what we do, we're trying to be fair to all sides. Doesn't mean we're going to give equal treatment to all sides, but to be fair to all sides. I think those of us, we are serving as accountability, or we're keeping ourselves accountable. I mean, I just had to do a correction today for a story that I wrote. Very minor thing. It was a number I got wrong. But the point is that we're going to publish on our website a statement that says like, this fact was wrong, and we regret the error, or something like that. And I think a lot of Americans don't really understand how journalists process that sort of thing and how committed we are to getting things right. But I will acknowledge that there are many people calling themselves journalists, calling themselves news media, who are really more just commentators slash entertainers and political performers, who oftentimes on cable news, who are are just completely playing fast and loose with the truth. And I don't think those people are really being held accountable. I'm not sure how to do it. But I would say that I don't think their influence is as wide as some people may think. Fox News only has 1 million or 2 viewers a night. There are 330 million people in this country. But to your second question, polarization and the internet, and unquestionably, one of the reasons why polarization has exploded is because of the fact that every person has a platform. And this is not to say that that's a bad thing, but I do think that when we look back on this, when someone writes about this 300 years from now, they'll probably just say, and then the internet was introduced, and then this all got really bad. That they'll have like one line about it. I think it's pretty simple in that way, but you and I are grappling with it and seeing it as it's unfolding. And I think what we have to do is look back and say, only 20 years ago, we as a society, I realize some of the students won't remember this, but we as a society, I'm only 37, so I grew up when the internet was kind of growing up as well. But we as a society lived in a culture in which, for the most part, facts and truth were largely on a daily basis authenticated by professionals, journalists who we trusted to do that. CBS Evening News or New York Times or Time Magazine or my former publication USA Today or whatever. It was difficult to go out and find conspiracy theories, for example. Like if you wanted to research, you thought the moon landing was fake. Okay, there are people out there who believe that, but before the internet, it would be difficult for you to find that information. You'd find it, but you'd have to look pretty hard. And it would be very hard for you to find other people who feel the same way. Now you can find the information and the other people within a few minutes. So the internet has accelerated the fact that we can congregate with each other. And so the question is, what do the social media companies have to do in response? And they've been very slow, of course. There's been many, many things written about this. We could discuss this at length as well. But I think, there's a culture clash between Silicon Valley and journalism. In journalism, we believe we have a responsibility to protect people from falsehoods. And social media companies believe their responsibility is to show you what you want to see. Well, I think the reality is humanity wants to encounter things that often we shouldn't encounter, because it'll make us distrust or hate or believe things that aren't true. And, I in a hypothetical world, I wonder what the vaccine rollout would have looked like without the internet. Would everyone just have gone out and gotten it because they trusted their local media or they trusted the government or, and they never questioned it. But in reality, now you can easily find information to confirm whatever biases you have. And I want to also note 80% of Americans, nearly 80% now of adults have gotten their first dose. So way fewer people than you think have not gotten one. But the point is that there is always going to be now people who are immersed in misinformation on both sides, by the way. Both sides, maybe not equal, but definitely it's not exclusive to one side or the other.
And the question remains, how do you if you're a social media executive, how do you stop the flow of what's clearly misinformation in a world that believes in free speech, First Amendment, blah, blah, blah? Very difficult question.
It is. And I think it starts with realizing that, free speech, as as an attorney, I'm sure in your constitutional law, you learn, the government cannot infringe on your free speech, but, private companies can make decisions all the time about what information they will or will not publish. And I think, Facebook, for example, which I think one of the biggest offenders historically on this issue, took a laissez-faire approach for basically allowing people to post whatever they want. They're being much more active now than they were before, which is good. But I think they need to start to take on the mindset of journalists. Now, you're going to think that's because I'm a journalist, and it is. But I tend to think that, you know what, the basic principles of journalism are actually what we as citizens kind of need now. Like, you have to be able to figure out what someone's source is. Is the source valid? You need to kind of like check multiple sources and things, but you also know, you just need to know who to trust. And Facebook has basically allowed, you know, different sources that are not trustworthy to propagate on the platform. From a technical perspective, they could easily, you know, limit the amount of information people see to certain sources. Now, I recognize that that would be very controversial, but you know, it's probably too late to do that. But had they started in a place where they said you have to be validated as an authentic provider of information, even if you maybe publish opinions that are, you know, we don't agree with, but if we can say your facts are true, are accurate, then maybe we'll let you on the platform. So, but I do think it's an encouraging sign that the social media companies are starting to realize they need to be more aggressive. And Facebook in particular has dialed down the amount of politics you see in the feed. So for anyone who uses politics or uses Facebook on this call, you may have noticed, or maybe not noticed until I tell you now, that you're not seeing as much politics in your feed now. I'm not. I don't know about you, but that's partly because Facebook has changed the algorithms a little bit to downgrade that. The thing is, here's the thing: keep this in mind. Algorithms are controlled by people. You know, it's oftentimes portrayed as AI, like artificial intelligence, but it's really just a big equation that someone wrote, and they can change anytime they want to show you different stuff.
Sam, you've been very patient. You must have another question.
I have one, and Nathan, you kind of talked about it. Just with all the challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic over the last couple of years, in Michigan, we know to the point it got to where there were threats against the governor, threats of kidnapping her, and so forth. How can we bridge the gap in kind of the differences that have come out of this pandemic, especially in approaches to how to end it, how to maybe slow the spread, stuff like that?
Yeah, profoundly challenging. And, you know, I think probably should start by saying we have to be realistic and realize like what is possible and what's not. And I would say it might be too late to do the kinds of things that we should have done if years ago, that maybe would have put us in a position to avoid what's happened. But in the spirit of trying to have a productive answer to your question, because I'm thinking more about like the next crisis already at this point. But I do think there are some things we can do. And I think, you know, it honestly starts with the basic humanity question of, you may despise your neighbor, you know, or the person who, you know, again, looks, thinks, or votes differently than you do, but do you want them to die? You know, is the question. And that's the stark reality of the pandemic is it has exposed the fact that polarization and misinformation can be deadly, you know, because there are people who are dying because they believed in something that turned out to be false, or followed someone who misled them, whether intentionally so or not. And I think we can agree we don't want people to die. And so we start there and say, you know, again, it goes back to that inescapable web of mutuality that, you know, our destinies are interwoven with each other. And I know that we can't get ahead unless we understand that we are caught together in that web. And so I think it starts with that. I know that that's like sort of pie in the sky, but it's like a really small way. But again, I think the basics of this are that those relationships, forming those relationships, from a more practical perspective, the question I do get asked often and kind of addresses what you're asking is like, how do you have a conversation with somebody about where you're trying to convince them to get vaccinated? And how do you build that bridge? You know, because that's a very specific bridge that a lot of us have had. Like probably everyone on this call has had that conversation with somebody where you're trying to convince them to do it, or have that conversation with them. And from all the research I did, all the people I talked to, I'm trying to like channel them and think, what would they collectively say? And I decided that they'd first say nothing. They'd listen first. And they'd actually like just hear out the other person and hear out what they think, what they have to say. Because what they told me, and I put this in the book, is that when you show someone that you care about their perspective and about their story and about who they are, then they're more likely to care about you and more likely to listen to you. It's like we live in this speak first, listen second culture, but bridge builders will listen first and speak second, because they know that when they do that, and this is what's so interesting, this is a principle for the lawyers, Ted, among the group, that's drawn directly from mediation principles, where the mediator does not go in and start telling them this is the way it is and you guys need to get along and all that. They first listen to everything and they figure out what's going on, and they show you that they're invested and that they care and they want to figure this out. And mediation principles, actually, this group I profiled in chapter 9 of the book, all about how those principles apply to real life too, because once you start listening, then you can start talking. And so, and then the second practical point of advice I've given people is to tell them why you got vaccinated, not why they should get vaccinated. And because listen, I'm a preacher's kid, so I happen to know this. People don't like to be preached to. They don't like to be preached to. So if you do that, they will recoil, and then you're not going to get anywhere. But when you share your perspective on just why it meant something to you, why you did it, you might actually have some success. It's actually, remember from high school English, show, don't tell, same thing.
I think a point I took from your book, it's always been important to me to listen. And one of the points you made so well is that listen is a sign of humility, and humility builds trust.
Yeah.
If I'm willing to listen to you, then I'm giving value to what you have to say, whether I agree or not.
Right.
And a nice thing about your book is you're not talking about everybody agreeing.
Right.
Exactly. You're talking about people listening and talking to one another and finding common ground. Yeah. And I think it starts with listening. Nathan Bomey is our guest tonight.
Let me just say real quick about that. Okay. I think that's an extremely important point, because you don't have to agree. You absolutely don't have to. Conflict is okay. And I think that's one thing we have to understand as well, that conflict is actually a key ingredient to democracy. If we don't have conflict, we don't have democracy, because that's what they call an authoritarian government. They don't have conflict there because they don't have the structure or the framework that allows it. We need conflict. It's how we deal with conflict. And the analogy is to fire. Fire can be good or bad. I mean, it's friction creates fire. So we have friction. We got plenty of that. We got a fire. We got a really bad fire. It's raging. It's burning things down. We need the fire. We need to use it for good. We need to use the fire as refiner's fire. That's what we need it. And so it's about how do you channel the conflict, not about trying to avoid it.
I have one question here that says, how would you purchase Nathan's book? He'll be happy to hear about that. You can get it online and buy it from Amazon or wherever. It's available easily. The name of it's Nathan Bomey, Bomey, and the book is called Bridge Builders, Bringing People Together in a Polarized Age. Bridge Builders, that's the key.
Yep.
Nathan, thank you so much. I always enjoy my conversations with you and wish we had more time. I want people to watch for your documentary, the documentary for which you're the screenwriter, which kind of grew out of your work on your book on the Detroit bankruptcy. It's called Gradually, Then Suddenly. I love the title. Gradually, Then Suddenly, the Bankruptcy of Detroit will be out sometime this year. And we hope somehow to get that and you here at the War Memorial. I want to thank Eddie Visco again for helping us, introducing us to Kearney Miller and Sam Howard, for a couple of students from Albion College, from the Ford Institute there, who thank you for being with us. It's good to see you both again. I had the privilege of meeting them once before on campus. Now, next month, Wednesday, February 16 at 7 o'clock, that night, Rochelle Riley will be with us to talk about her new book. It's called That They Lived, African Americans Who Changed the World, published by the Wayne State University Press. Rochelle Riley ended a nearly 20-year career as an award-winning Detroit columnist in 2019 to become the City of Detroit's Director of Arts and Culture. She's a former colleague of Nathan's, of course, at the Free Press. She now guides the city's investment in the creative economy and transformative innovation. Rochelle Riley's lots of things: an essayist, keynote speaker, artist, a writer by trade, warrior by necessity. In addition to her new book, she's the author of The Burden of African Americans and the Enduring Impact of Slavery, published by Wayne State University Press in 2018. Rochelle Riley travels the country hosting conversations about the burden that America still bears by refusing to deal with the aftermath of American enslavement. She was a 2016 inductee in the Michigan Journalism Hall of Fame, 2019 inductee in the North Carolina Media and Journalism Hall of Fame, and a 2021 inductee into the National Association of Black Journalists Hall of Fame. Like tonight, this will be an online session for which you can register through the War Memorial's website starting later this week. That'll be February 16, 7 p.m. We look forward to that, to having Rochelle with us. Nathan, you might want to join us that night.
Rochelle is a star in my world. And when I worked with her at the Detroit Free Press, it was always exciting when I got to chat with her. She will be wonderful.
I'm sure she will be. You are too. Thank you so much for being with us. And with that, I wish you all a good week and a good night.